They say children's laughter should echo with innocence, but at St. Agnes Orphanage, their voices were silenced in 1911, smothered by something far darker than poverty or neglect. Forgotten by time, buried under soot and whispers, the orphanage's story remains, but so do the cries of the ones who never left. The morning of October 13th, 1911, dawned grey and cold over the town of Millbrook, but the smoke rising from the hill made the sky darker still. Agnes Orphanage, once a beacon of charity for the forgotten children of the valley, now stood as nothing more than a skeleton of blackened stone and twisted iron. The fire had burned through the night, with an intensity that defied explanation. Witnesses claimed the flames reached toward heaven itself, as if the very earth were trying to purge something unholy. Father Michael Callahan's body was found in the basement, kneeling in what appeared to be prayer, though the heat had been so intense that little remained to identify him beyond his clerical collar, now fused to charred bone. The official count listed 37 children dead, their small bodies discovered huddled in dormitories where doors had been locked from the outside. The townspeople gathered in the ruins that morning spoke in hushed tones, their breath visible in the unseasonably cold air that seemed to cling to the orphanage grounds. "Divine judgment," whispered Mrs. Hartford, the baker's wife, clutching her rosary with trembling fingers. "The Lord has spoken against the sins of this place." But others were not so certain. Old Henrik, who delivered supplies to the orphanage twice weekly, shook his head as he stared at the ruins. "There were screams that night," he said, his voice barely audible above the wind. But they weren't screams of fire. They were screams of something else entirely. Sister Miriam Thorne survived only because she had been in town that evening, visiting the sick at the parish hospital. When she returned at dawn to find the orphanage consumed, witnesses said she fell to her knees and wept with such violence that she had to be carried away. She spoke to no one of what she had seen in her years at St. Agnes, taking her silence first to a convent in Boston and later to her grave. The investigation, such as it was, lasted merely 3 days. Sheriff Edmund Walsh, a man more concerned with maintaining order than seeking truth, declared the fire an accident caused by a faulty chimney. The church, eager to distance itself from scandal, accepted this explanation with unseemly haste. Father Callahan was posthumously praised as a hero who died trying to save his charges, and the case was sealed in the county records with a finality that suggested relief rather than justice. But fires leave more than ash. They leave questions. Why were the dormitory doors locked from the outside? Why did the flames burn so hot that they melted iron, but left Father Callahan's basement prayer chamber largely intact? And why, in the weeks following the fire, did children in the surrounding towns wake screaming from nightmares of burning corridors and reaching hands? The orphanage grounds were abandoned, deemed cursed by locals who crossed themselves when passing the ruins. Weeds grew through the foundation stones, and ivy claimed the remaining walls, but the building's shadow seemed to stretch farther than natural light should allow. Years became decades, and decades became a century, yet the charred bones of St. Agnes remained, stubborn as a bad conscience. In 2011, exactly 100 years after the fire, Eleanor Price arrived in Millbrook, with nothing but a weathered satchel, a digital camera, and an obsession with forgotten tragedies. She was a doctoral student in historical preservation, drawn to St. Agnes by a single newspaper clipping she'd discovered in the Boston Public Library archives, a brief mention of the fire that had been filed incorrectly under agricultural accidents rather than disasters. The misplacement struck her as deliberate, the kind of bureaucratic burial that suggested someone had wanted this story to disappear. The clipping had been brief, almost dismissive. Fire destroys local orphanage, faulty chimney blamed. But tucked beneath it, barely visible, was a fragment of another article, its headline half torn but still legible. Questions remain about locked doors at the rest had been lost to time and careless handling, but those words had haunted Eleanor for months. Standing now before the ruins of St. Agnes, Eleanor felt the familiar thrill of discovery mixed with something else, something colder and more unsettling. The October air carried the scent of old smoke, impossible after a century, but unmistakable nonetheless. The orphanage walls, still standing in places, seemed to watch her with empty window frames that gaped like hollow eyes. Her research had revealed troubling gaps in the official record. Adoption papers that should have existed were missing. Birth certificates for the children had been destroyed in a clerical fire at the parish office just 1 week after the orphanage burned. Even the cemetery records were incomplete. 37 children had died, but only 19 graves had been dug in the town cemetery. Where were the other 18? As evening approached and shadows grew long across the orphanage grounds, Eleanor unpacked her equipment with methodical precision. She had stayed in haunted places before, armed with nothing but rationality and recording devices, documenting the stories that history tried to forget. But as she set up her tent in what had once been the orphanage courtyard, she couldn't shake the feeling that this place was different. The wind through the ruins carried sounds that might have been settling stones or might have been whispered voices. The temperature dropped with the sun, but the cold seemed to emanate from the ground itself, seeping up through the earth as if the very soil remembered the heat of that long-ago fire. Eleanor lit her camping lantern and opened Clara's diary, a slim volume bound in cracked leather that she had purchased from an estate sale in Boston. The dealer had sworn it came from St. Agnes, though he couldn't say how it had survived the fire. As Eleanor read the first entry, dated September 1911, just weeks before the tragedy, the wind stilled completely, as if the very air was holding its breath. And somewhere in the silence that followed she heard it, faint but unmistakable, the sound of a child weeping echoing from stones that had witnessed unspeakable sorrow. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to be forgotten so completely that even your death becomes a lie? What would you do if your final moments were erased, your suffering dismissed, your very existence deemed inconvenient to those who survived? The morning after her first night at St. Agnes brought no comfort to Eleanor Price. She had slept fitfully, awakened repeatedly by sounds that rational thought insisted were merely the settling of old stones and the whisper of wind through broken masonry. But sleep had brought dreams, vivid, haunting visions of children moving through darkened corridors, their bare feet making no sound on cold stone floors. The townspeople of Millbrook regarded Eleanor with the kind of suspicious courtesy reserved for outsiders who ask too many questions. At Murphy's General Store, where she purchased supplies, the elderly proprietor's eyes had narrowed when she mentioned St. Agnes. "Nothing good ever came from that place," he muttered, refusing to meet her gaze as he rang up her purchases. "Best to let sleeping dogs lie, miss. Some stories aren't meant for telling." But Mrs. Catherine Henley, the town librarian, proved more forthcoming, though her assistance came with warnings wrapped in whispered urgency. "You shouldn't be staying out there alone," she said, her arthritic fingers trembling as she pulled dusty volumes from restricted shelves. Incidents over the years, campers who left in the middle of the night, too scared to collect their belongings. Children who dared each other to climb the orphanage walls, only to come running home with stories of voices calling their names. The library's records were frustratingly incomplete, but Eleanor found enough fragments to begin painting a picture of life at St. Agnes before the fire. The orphanage had housed between 30 and 50 children at any given time, taking in the unwanted offspring of factory workers and immigrants who had died in industrial accidents or succumbed to the diseases that plagued the overcrowded tenements. Father Callahan had arrived at St. Agnes in 1908, replacing Father Benedict Morse, who had served the orphanage for nearly 2 decades with distinction. The record showed that under Morse's care, the orphanage had maintained detailed logs of each child's arrival, medical care, and eventual placement with families throughout New England. But after Callahan's appointment, the record-keeping became sporadic, then nearly non-existent. "He changed things," Mrs. Henley said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "My grandmother worked in the parish office back then. She said Father Callahan was intense, Obsessed with sin and purification, he gave sermons about the wickedness that lived in children's hearts, how it had to be driven out through discipline and prayer. Eleanor studied a photograph from 1910, one of the few surviving images of the orphanage before the fire. The children stood in rigid rows before the main building, their faces solemn and somehow hollow. Father Callahan stood behind them, a tall, gaunt figure, whose eyes seemed to burn even in the faded sepia tones. But it was Sister Miriam who drew Eleanor's attention, a young woman standing apart from the group, her expression not merely serious but haunted, as if she were looking at something terrible just beyond the camera's frame. That evening, Eleanor returned to the ruins with a new purpose. She had identified the locations of key rooms from the surviving architectural plans, the dormitories where the children had died, the chapel where they had prayed, and most intriguingly, the basement areas that official reports claimed had been used for storage, but which seemed unusually large and complex for such a simple purpose. As darkness fell, Eleanor set up her recording equipment throughout the ruins, hoping to capture evidence of the paranormal activity that locals claimed plagued the site. But as she worked, adjusting microphones and positioning cameras, she began to feel observed, not by the casual curiosity of wildlife or the imagined watching of empty windows, but by something aware and intent. The sensation grew stronger as she explored what remained of the children's dormitories. Here, the fire damage was most severe, yet fragments of daily life remained: a child's shoe, scorched but recognizable, pieces of a slate tablet bearing the carefully formed letters of a beginning reader, a small wooden cross, its paint blistered but still bearing the inscription, "For Thomas, with love." Thomas. Eleanor had seen that name in several documents, always accompanied by notations that suggested disciplinary problems. Willful, RID 1 report, defiant of authority and a bad influence on younger children. But as Eleanor held the small cross, she wondered what forms Thomas's defiance had taken. What had he seen that made him rebel against the order of St. Agnes? In the chapel, where stone walls had better survived the fire, Eleanor found fragments of stained glass scattered across the floor like jeweled tears. She knelt to examine them more closely and noticed something odd. Many of the pieces showed signs of having been broken from the inside, as if someone had deliberately shattered the windows. The pattern of glass suggested violence, desperation even. It was there, kneeling among the broken glass, that Eleanor first heard the voices clearly. Not the vague whispers and settling sounds that might have been imagination, but distinct words carried on air that held no wind. "She's here." Finally, someone came. "Tell them what happened to us." Eleanor's rational mind insisted these were auditory hallucinations brought on by exhaustion and suggestion, but her heart knew better. These were the voices of children, young voices carrying the weight of unfinished business and unspoken truth. She remained motionless for long minutes, listening as the voices faded into silence, leaving only the sound of her own rapid breathing and the distant call of night birds. When she finally rose, her knees shaking from more than just the cold stone, she found fresh scratches in the dust around her, marks that might have been made by small fingers reaching through the veil between worlds. Back at her campsite, Eleanor attempted to review the day's recordings, but static filled every device, punctuated by sounds that might have been whispers or might have been something else entirely. As she worked, her laptop screen flickered intermittently, and she could swear she saw faces in the distortion, young faces with eyes that held too much knowledge of suffering. Clara's diary lay open beside her, its pages fluttering in a breeze that touched nothing else. The entries were written in a careful, childish hand that spoke of desperate attempts to record truth in a place where truth was dangerous. As Eleanor read, she began to understand that the children of St. Agnes had not died as victims of accident or neglect, but as witnesses to something far more terrible. The last entry Eleanor read before exhaustion claimed her was dated October 10th, 1911, just 3 days before the fire. "Father Callahan took Henry to the basement again last night. Sister Miriam cried in the chapel afterward, but she won't tell us why. I don't think Henry is coming back. None of them come back. I'm going to hide this diary where the flames can't reach it, because someone needs to know what happens in the dark. Someone needs to remember us when we're gone. As Eleanor drifted toward uneasy sleep, the sounds of the night seemed to organize themselves into a pattern: footsteps on stone, the rustle of clothing, the whispered prayers of children who had learned to fear the dark, and underneath it all, a sound that might have been sobbing, or might have been the wind through broken walls, carrying the weight of secrets that demanded to be told. Eleanor woke before dawn, pulled from sleep by the sound of sobbing that seemed to emanate from the very stones around her. The crying was soft but persistent, the kind of weeping that comes from a grief so profound it has worn grooves in the soul. As consciousness returned fully, the sounds faded, leaving only the pre-dawn stillness and the metallic taste of fear on her tongue. Clara's diary lay open beside her sleeping bag, though Eleanor was certain she had closed it before sleeping. The pages fluttered in a breeze that touched nothing else in her tent, settling on an entry dated September 15th, 1911. The childish handwriting seemed to pulse in the dim light of Eleanor's flashlight. Mary Catherine disappeared last night. Sister Miriam told us she was adopted by a family in Providence, but Mary Catherine said no family would want her because of the scars on her arms. She showed them to me once, thin white lines like someone had been cutting her with something sharp. "These aren't from accidents," she whispered. "These are from the ceremonies." I don't know what ceremonies she meant, but I'm afraid to ask. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read. The implication was horrifying, but as a historian, she had learned to approach evidence with measured skepticism. Yet the diary's authenticity was undeniable. The ink had faded naturally, the paper bore the correct watermarks for the period, and most tellingly, the child's observations contained details that no modern forger could have known. She made her way to the orphanage chapel as morning light began to filter through the skeletal remains of the roof. The space felt different in daylight, less ominous but somehow more sorrowful, as if the stones themselves mourned what they had witnessed. It was here, according to Clara's carefully drawn map in the diary's back pages, that the hidden compartment lay behind the altar. The loose brick Clara had described was exactly where the map indicated, hidden behind a section of wall that fire damage had partially concealed. Eleanor's archaeological training served her well as she carefully worked the brick free, mindful of preserving whatever lay behind it. The compartment was small but deep, and inside she found not just Clara's diary pages she hadn't yet read, but other items: a small wooden doll with its face deliberately scratched away, a piece of rope that might once have been a belt, and most disturbing of all, what appeared to be a child's tooth, wrapped carefully in a scrap of cloth. Clara's later entries painted an increasingly horrifying picture of life at St. Agnes under Father Callahan's care. The children were subjected to purification rituals that seemed to involve physical punishment and psychological torment. Those who resisted or asked questions were taken to the basement for private instruction with Father Callahan. Some returned days later, quiet and withdrawn. Others never returned at all. "Thomas tried to protect us," Clara wrote in an entry dated October 1st. "When Father Callahan came for little Emma, Thomas stood in front of her and said he would go instead. Father Callahan smiled. It was terrible to see him smile, and said that such nobility would be rewarded. They took them both. Emma came back 3 days later, but she won't speak now, won't eat, just rocks back and forth and stares at nothing. Thomas never came back at all." Eleanor found herself crying as she read, her tears falling onto pages that had waited a century to have their truth acknowledged. The clinical historian in her documented everything methodically, photographing each page, noting the progression of Clara's handwriting from careful optimism to desperate urgency. But the human being in her raged at the injustice of children suffering, while adults who should have protected them instead facilitated their torment. Sister Miriam emerged from the diary entries as a tragic figure, a young woman who clearly knew something terrible was happening, but lacked the power or courage to stop it. Clara wrote of finding the nun weeping in the chapel after particularly bad nights, of Sister Miriam's attempts to shield the children from Father Callahan's attention, and of her growing desperation as the situation deteriorated. Sister Miriam tried to send a letter to the bishop, read an entry from early October. She wrote it in the library and hid it in her prayer book. But Father Callahan found it. He called her to his office, and we could hear her crying from the dormitory. When she came out, her face was red, and there were marks on her wrists. She hasn't tried to write any more letters. The basement figured prominently in Clara's accounts, described as a place of ceremonies that none of the children understood but all feared. Father Callahan would take selected children down the stone steps behind the kitchen, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. The basement was supposed to be used for food storage, but Clara had noticed that no supplies were ever brought up from below, and the children who worked in the kitchen were forbidden from accessing the lower level. "There are sounds from down there," Clara wrote. "Chanting sometimes, but in words that don't sound like Latin, and screaming, but not the kind of screaming when someone is hurt. This screaming sounds different, like someone is being hurt in their soul, not just their body." Eleanor's archaeological instincts told her she needed to find the basement entrance Clara described. The fire damage made navigation difficult, but the kitchen area was still partially identifiable from the remains of large stone ovens and prep surfaces. Behind what had once been the main cooking area, she found stones that had been arranged differently from the rest of the foundation, a rectangular outline that suggested a stairway had once descended into the earth. The passage was partially collapsed, filled with debris and ash from the fire, but Eleanor could see that it led down into darkness. The air that rose from below carried scents that had no business existing after a century. Incense, something metallic that might have been old blood, and underneath it all, the sweet sick smell of decay. As she peered into the shadows, Eleanor heard a sound that made her blood freeze, the distant echo of children singing. Not the joyful songs of childhood, but something that sounded like a dirge, voices raised in harmony, but filled with sadness beyond comprehension. The melody was haunting, beautiful, and utterly wrong, as if innocence itself had been perverted into something dark and sorrowful. Clara's final entries, written in increasingly frantic handwriting as the fire approached, revealed the truth that had died with the children of St. Agnes. Father Callahan isn't trying to save our souls. He's trying to trade them for something. I heard him talking to the thing that lives in the basement. It doesn't sound human when it answers. Sister Miriam knows, she's known all along, but she's too afraid to stop it. The thing is hungry, and Father Callahan feeds it. He feeds it to us. I'm going to hide this diary where the fire can't reach it. Maybe someday someone will find it and know what really happened here. We aren't just dying, we're being consumed, and I don't think it ends when our bodies burn. I think we'll still be here, still trapped, until someone sets us free. If anyone reads this, please help us. Don't let them say we died by accident. Don't let them pretend we were just unlucky. We were murdered, and our murderer wears the robes of God. Eleanor closed the diary with shaking hands, understanding now why the children's voices still echoed through the ruins. They weren't just ghosts haunting an old building. They were witnesses demanding justice, victims crying out against a conspiracy of silence that had lasted for 100 years. As evening approached, and shadows began to gather among the ruins, Eleanor made a decision that went against every instinct of self-preservation she possessed. She was going to excavate the basement entrance, no matter how dangerous it might be. Clara and the other children deserved to have their story told, and Eleanor was beginning to understand that she might be the only person capable of telling it. But as she worked to clear debris from the passage, she couldn't shake the feeling that something down in the darkness was waiting for her, something that had been patient for a very long time, but whose patience was finally coming to an end. The work of clearing the basement entrance consumed Eleanor's entire day, each stone and beam removed, revealing more of the staircase that descended into the earth beneath St. Agnes. The construction was unusual. The steps were carved from single blocks of stone, fitted together with a precision that suggested importance far beyond a simple storage cellar. Strange symbols had been etched into the walls, worn smooth by time but still visible to her trained eye. They weren't Christian iconography, nor were they consistent with any religious tradition she recognized. Clara's diary entries became increasingly desperate as Eleanor read deeper, chronicling the systematic disappearance of the orphanage's children, with the methodical horror of a child who understood she was documenting her own approaching doom. The pattern was always the same. Father Callahan would select a child, usually one who had shown defiance or asked too many questions, and take them to the basement for special instruction. Some returned changed, silent, withdrawn, marked by an emptiness that their fellow orphans found more frightening than any physical injury. Others never returned at all. Samuel asked where Thomas went. Clara wrote in an entry dated October 5, 1911. Father Callahan said Thomas had been blessed with a special calling and had gone to serve God in a higher capacity. But Sarah found Thomas's clothes in the furnace room, burned and bloody. When she told Father Callahan what she'd seen, he took her downstairs too. She came back 3 days later, but she won't speak about Thomas anymore. She won't speak about anything anymore. Eleanor's research at the town records office had confirmed Clara's observations with chilling precision. Cross-referencing the orphanage's official rolls with cemetery records, adoption papers and church documents revealed a disturbing truth. Beginning in 1909, shortly after Father Callahan's arrival, children began disappearing from St. Agnes at an unprecedented rate. The official explanation was always the same. They had been placed with families in distant cities, adopted by couples seeking to provide Christian homes for unfortunate children. But Eleanor's meticulous investigation revealed that these adoptions existed only on paper. The families listed as adopting the children couldn't be found in any records. The addresses provided led to empty lots or businesses that had never existed. When Eleanor attempted to trace these phantom adoptions through ecclesiastical channels, she discovered that the relevant documents had been destroyed in a series of convenient fires and clerical accidents that occurred throughout the 1920s and 1930s. Mrs. Agnes Hartwell, now 93 and residing in Millbrook's only nursing home, had been one of the few children to leave St. Agnes alive before the fire. Her memories were fragmented by age and trauma, but her terror remained sharp and immediate when Eleanor mentioned Father Callahan's name. "He had cold hands," she whispered, clutching Eleanor's arm with surprising strength. "Cold hands and empty eyes. He said he was saving us from damnation, but he was the one who brought damnation to that place. The sounds from the basement. God forgive me. I still hear them in my dreams." Mrs. Hartwell's account provided crucial details that corroborated Clara's diary. The basement ceremonies occurred on specific nights, always during the new moon, and always preceded by days of fasting that Father Callahan claimed would purify the chosen children's souls for their holy purpose. The other children were locked in their dormitories during these rituals, but sounds carried through the old building's stone walls, chanting in unfamiliar languages, crying that began as human voices, but gradually became something else entirely, and underneath it all, a sound like rushing wind that seemed to come from deep within the earth. "Sister Miriam tried to warn us," Mrs. Hartwell continued, her voice becoming clearer as the memories surfaced. She would find excuses to take children away from the orphanage during those nights, sudden illnesses that required treatment at the hospital, fictional relatives who needed to be visited. She saved as many as she could, but she couldn't save them all, and she couldn't save herself from knowing what was happening to the ones she couldn't protect. Eleanor's excavation of the basement entrance progressed slowly, hampered by structural instability and her growing reluctance to actually descend into the depths below. The air that rose from the passage carried scents that defied rational explanation, smoke from fires that had burned a century ago, incense that should have long since dissipated, and something else, something organic and wrong that made her stomach turn. But it was the sounds that truly unnerved her. As she worked, clearing debris and documenting her progress, she began to hear whispered conversations echoing from below. Children's voices speaking in hushed tones about things no child should ever have to discuss. "Do you think it will hurt?" Father Callahan says it's an honor, but his eyes say something different. "I don't want to go down there. I don't want to see what lives in the dark." Eleanor found herself responding to these phantom voices, offering comfort to children who had been dead for 100 years. "I know you're scared. I'm going to help you. I'm going to tell everyone what really happened here." The voices would fall silent at her words, but she could feel attention focusing on her, dozens of young spirits drawing closer, their hope and desperation almost tangible in the cool air of the ruins. They were waiting, she realized, for someone to finally witness their truth and carry it back to the world of the living. Clara's diary revealed the full scope of Father Callahan's systematic predation. Over the course of nearly 3 years, he had taken 47 children to the basement for his ceremonies. 19 had never returned. 28 had come back fundamentally changed, hollow-eyed and silent, marked by experiences that had stolen something essential from their souls. The diary included careful observations of these returned children, noting how they flinched at shadows, wept without apparent cause, and spoke in their sleep using words that weren't in any language Clara recognized. "Emma draws pictures now," Clara wrote in one of her final entries. "She won't talk, but she draws constantly." The pictures show a room deep underground, with symbols carved into the walls and something dark crouched in the center. Something has too many arms and too many eyes, and it's reaching towards small figures that look like children. When I asked Emma what the something was, she looked at me with those empty eyes and whispered, "The hungry god, Father Callahan's hungry god." The revelation struck Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. Father Callahan hadn't been a pedophile or a simple sadist. He had been something far worse. He had been a cultist, using his position of authority and trust to offer children as sacrifices to some entity that dwelt in the darkness beneath St. Agnes. The orphanage hadn't been a house of charity. It had been a feeding ground for something that consumed innocence itself. As night fell, and Eleanor prepared to make her first descent into the basement, she read Clara's final entry by flashlight. "Tomorrow is October 13th. Father Callahan says it will be a night of great rejoicing, that the hungry god will finally receive the offering it has been promised. He's chosen 12 of us for the ceremony, all the children who still have fight left in them, all the ones who remember what it felt like to hope. I know I'm one of the 12. I can see it in his eyes when he looks at me. Sister Miriam is packing a bag. She's going to run tonight, after everyone is asleep. She begged me to come with her, but I can't leave the little ones. Someone has to stay and try to protect them, even if protection is impossible. Someone has to witness what happens, even if the witness doesn't survive. If anyone finds this diary, know that we didn't die by accident. We were murdered by a man who wore the robes of God, but served something that was God's opposite. And I don't think our deaths will be the end of it. I think the hungry God will still be hungry, and Father Callahan will find new ways to feed it. Remember us. Please, whoever you are, remember that we were here and that we mattered, and that we died for the sins of adults who should have protected us instead of betraying us to the darkness." Eleanor closed the diary and looked down into the basement passage, now clear enough for her to descend. The voices of the children seemed to grow stronger as darkness deepened, their whispered pleas and warnings creating a chorus of the damned that made her skin crawl and her heart break simultaneously. She checked her equipment one final time: flashlights, camera, recording devices, and a can of gasoline she had purchased that afternoon for reasons she couldn't yet articulate. Something told her that before this night was over, Fire would once again play a role in the story of Saint Agnes. But this time she hoped it would bring purification rather than concealment. The first step down into the basement felt like crossing a threshold between worlds, leaving behind the realm of the living and entering a space where the dead had been waiting patiently for justice. As Eleanor descended into the darkness, she carried with her the weight of 47 murdered children's stories and the growing certainty that their killer's work had not ended with the fire of 1911. The basement of St. Agnes opened before Eleanor like the throat of some ancient beast, its stone walls slick with moisture that had no source and carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Her flashlight beam revealed a space far larger than the orphanage's foundation should have allowed, a vast chamber that extended beyond the reach of her light, with passages branching off into deeper darkness, like arteries feeding a corrupted heart. The air was thick with the residue of old rituals, heavy with incense that carried undertones of sulfur and decay. Every breath felt like an invasion, as if the very atmosphere was contaminated with the echoes of unspeakable acts. Eleanor's recording equipment immediately began malfunctioning, cameras producing images filled with static and shadows that moved independently of their sources, audio devices capturing whispers in languages that predated human civilization. The central chamber was dominated by a massive stone altar, its surface stained dark with substances that Eleanor's imagination refused to identify. Around the altar, carved into the floor in a complex pattern, were the same symbols she had glimpsed on the stairway walls, intricate designs that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed peripherally, as if they were not merely images but windows into something that existed beyond normal perception. Clara's diary had prepared Eleanor for much of what she found, but the reality exceeded even the child's careful documentation of horror. Scattered around the altar were personal belongings that had clearly belonged to children, shoes worn thin by small feet, fragments of clothing, toys carved from wood and stone. But most disturbing were the bones, small, delicate bones arranged in patterns that suggested they had been placed with ritual precision rather than discarded carelessly. Eleanor's archaeological training allowed her to recognize the arrangement for what it was, a summoning circle, designed according to principles that were far older than Christianity, but corrupted by someone who understood how to pervert ancient knowledge for modern evil. Father Callahan had not been a simple madman or even a conventional Satanist. He had been something far more dangerous, a scholar of forbidden things who had discovered how to bridge the gap between worlds and invite something hungry into the realm of the living. The wall behind the altar bore carved inscriptions in multiple languages, Latin mixed with symbols that resembled cuneiform hieroglyphics that had been deliberately defaced and reassembled into new configurations, and underneath it all, text in a script that Eleanor's education couldn't identify, but which seemed to squirm beneath her gaze like living things. She photographed everything, her camera flash illuminating the chamber in stark, hellish moments that revealed more than she wanted to see. In one corner, she found what appeared to be Father Callahan's journal, its leather binding preserved by the basement's unnatural atmosphere. The journal's contents made Clara's diary seem like pleasant bedtime reading by comparison. Callahan's writings revealed a man who had begun his tenure at St. Agnes with genuine religious conviction, but had gradually been corrupted by contact with something that called itself the devourer of innocence. The entity had appeared to him first in dreams, then in waking visions, offering him knowledge and power in exchange for what it termed pure offerings, children whose souls had not yet been tainted by the compromises and corruptions of adult life. The devourer has shown me the truth behind God's silence, Callahan had written in an entry dated December 1908. The Almighty does not answer prayers because he is already dead, consumed by older, hungrier things that ruled the darkness before light was even conceived. The devourer offers a better covenant, power for those wise enough to serve, and protection for those who provide the sustenance it requires. The journal detailed Callahan's gradual descent into complete moral abandonment. His first offering had been a terminally ill child named Michael, whom Callahan convinced himself was already dying, and therefore a mercy-killing. But the devourer's appetite had grown with each feeding, demanding healthier children, more elaborate rituals, and eventually the systematic harvesting of the orphanage's entire population. Sister Miriam suspects read an entry from June 1911. She watches me with those accusing eyes, as if her small mind could comprehend the cosmic significance of what I am accomplishing. I have tried to educate her, to show her glimpses of the truth, but she clings to her primitive Christian superstitions. Soon I will have to decide whether to include her in the final ceremony, or simply dispose of her as an obstacle to the great work. Eleanor's hands shook as she read about the final ceremony that Callahan had planned for October 13, 1911. The priest had intended to sacrifice all remaining children in the orphanage simultaneously, creating a mass offering that would allow the devourer to fully manifest in the physical world. Sister Miriam's escape and subsequent fire had interrupted this plan, but Callahan's writings suggested that the interruption was only temporary. "The devourer is patient," he had written in what appeared to be his final entry, dated the morning of October 13th. "If the great work cannot be completed tonight, it will wait for another opportunity, another servant, another generation of innocents to feed its hunger. Death cannot break the covenant I have forged. The basement will remain consecrated to its service, and those who died here will remain bound to its will until the final ceremony is completed." The implications of Callahan's words struck Eleanor with horrifying clarity. The children who had died in the fire hadn't found peace. They had been trapped by the priest's ritual, bound to the basement and the entity that dwelt there, unable to move on until someone completed or destroyed the work that had claimed their lives. As if summoned by her understanding, the voices of the children began to manifest more clearly in the chamber. Eleanor could see them now, translucent figures arranged around the altar, their ghostly forms bearing the wounds and marks of their final moments. Some showed signs of ritual murder, others the effects of the fire, but all wore expressions of desperate hope as they looked at her. Clara stood among them, her spirit somehow more solid and coherent than the others, her diary clutched against her chest like a shield against the darkness. She moved closer to Eleanor, her lips forming words that echoed in the living woman's mind rather than her ears. "He's still here. Father Callahan didn't die in the fire. He joined with the devourer, became part of it. The ceremony bound him to this place, just as it bound us. He's been waiting, growing stronger, preparing for someone who could complete his work, or someone who could destroy it." The temperature in the chamber began to drop precipitously, and Eleanor's breath became visible in puffs of vapor that glowed strangely in her flashlight beam. The shadows around the altar began to move independently, coalescing into a shape that was nearly human but wrong in ways that made her eyes water and her mind recoil. Father Callahan's voice, hollow and echoing, as if it came from the bottom of a deep well, filled the chamber. "You have come to witness the completion of God's true work. How fitting that a scholar should be present to document the moment when the devourer finally receives its promised feast." Eleanor found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "I've come to free these children, to tell their story and end whatever you started here." Callahan's laughter was like the sound of breaking glass mixed with screaming wind. "Free them, child. You understand nothing. They are not prisoners. They are the foundation upon which a new reality will be built. Their suffering has seasoned them, made them perfect offerings for the devourer's appetite. And now you will join them, completing the circle that was interrupted so long ago." The shadows around Eleanor began to move closer, reaching toward her with tendrils that felt both incorporeal and terrifyingly solid. The ghostly children pressed closer as well, but not to threaten, to protect. Clara's spirit stood directly in front of Eleanor, her small form blazing with a light that drove back the encroaching darkness. "Run," Clara whispered, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced ultimate evil and refused to surrender. "Run now while you still can." Come back with fire, clean fire, that will burn away the corruption and free us from this place." Eleanor needed no further encouragement. She turned and fled toward the stairs, her equipment forgotten in her desperate need to escape the chamber before whatever had once been Father Callahan could complete his century-old work. Behind her she could hear the priest's voice raised in chanting that made her bones ache and her soul shiver, words in the language of the entity he served, calling upon powers that should never have been awakened. She reached the surface gasping and shaking, her mind reeling from what she had witnessed. But even as terror threatened to overwhelm her, Eleanor felt a strange sense of purpose settling over her. Clara and the other children were counting on her, trusting her to find a way to break the bonds that held them in that place of corruption and despair. The fire that had begun this story had been an attempt to hide evil. The fire that would end it would be an instrument of purification, burning away the darkness and setting the innocent free. Eleanor looked back at the basement entrance, now sealed once more behind fallen debris, and began to plan. Eleanor's nights became waking nightmares. The basement chamber had marked her, leaving traces of its corruption clinging to her spirit like spiritual poison. She could feel Father Callahan's presence following her, a cold weight that pressed against her consciousness whenever she tried to sleep. The children's voices grew stronger too, but now they carried desperation alongside their pleas for help. Her hotel room in Millbrook became a fortress of salt circles and religious symbols, not because Eleanor had become superstitious, but because the supernatural attacks were undeniably real. Objects moved on their own, shadows took shapes that defied natural explanation, and her reflection in mirrors sometimes showed additional figures standing behind her. She had crossed a threshold in that basement, entering a war between forces that had been locked in conflict for over a century. The dreams were the worst part. Every time Eleanor closed her eyes, she found herself reliving the night of October 13th, 1911, but not as an observer. She experienced it through the children's eyes, feeling their terror, as Father Callahan led them down into the basement for the final ceremony. She felt the ropes binding their small wrists, tasted the bitter herbs forced down their throats to prepare them for sacrifice, and watched through their eyes as the priest began the ritual that would feed their souls to the devourer. In the dreams, she saw Sister Miriam's final act of defiance. Not fleeing as the records suggested, but returning to the orphanage with a can of kerosene and the desperate hope that fire might destroy what she couldn't stop through conventional means. The young nun had known she was likely condemning herself along with the children, but she had also known that some fates were worse than death. "She tried to save us," Clara's spirit whispered during one of Eleanor's waking visions. Sister Miriam set the fire to stop the ceremony, but it was too late. Father Callahan had already begun the binding ritual. The flames couldn't reach the basement before he completed the summoning. "We died in the fire, but our souls were already trapped by his magic." Eleanor's investigation expanded beyond the orphanage records, delving into church archives and ecclesiastical histories that revealed Father Callahan's background. Born Mikhail Kowalski in Poland, he had changed his name when he emigrated to America in 1895. His seminary records showed promise, exceptional grades in theology and ancient languages, with particular expertise in comparative religious studies that seemed to focus on pre-Christian belief systems. But there were gaps in his history, periods of study abroad that weren't fully documented, and references to research into apocryphal texts that had concerned his instructors. One letter from a seminary professor, dated 1897, expressed worry about young Kowalski's unhealthy fascination with heretical doctrines and recommended careful supervision to ensure his studies remain within orthodox boundaries. The church had failed in that supervision, or perhaps had been deceived by Callahan's apparent devotion to his duties. His assignment to Saint Agnes had been routine, intended as a simple pastoral role that would keep him occupied with practical matters rather than theological speculation. But the isolation of the orphanage had provided perfect cover for his true work. Eleanor found corroborating evidence in medical records from the period. Children who had briefly attended the local school during their time at St. Agnes showed signs consistent with systematic abuse, not just physical violence but psychological trauma that their teachers had noted with concern. The school records included observations about students who seemed unnaturally aged beyond their years and who displayed knowledge of adult matters inappropriate to their station. Dr. Margaret Hennessy, who had served as the town's physician during the orphanage years, had left notes that painted a disturbing picture of her interactions with the children. The Agnes children, she had written in her private journal, exhibit symptoms I cannot readily classify. They speak of nightmares that seem too detailed and specific to be products of normal childish imagination. Several have described identical visions of a presence they call the hungry shadow that visits them in the basement. I have attempted to examine the orphanage's basement facilities, but Father Callahan has refused my requests, citing ecclesiastical privilege. As Eleanor's research deepened, the supernatural harassment intensified. She began finding messages scratched into her hotel walls, warnings and pleas written in childish handwriting that appeared overnight, despite the room's locked door. Her electronic devices malfunctioned constantly, displaying images of the basement ceremony when she tried to review her photographs, or playing recordings of children's voices when she attempted to document her findings. The most unnerving incidents involved physical contact. Eleanor would wake to find small handprints on her arms, as if ghostly children had been trying to shake her awake. The prints were always cold, leaving frostbite-like marks that took days to fade. Sometimes she felt small hands grasping at her clothes, pulling her toward windows or doors, trying to guide her somewhere she couldn't yet understand. Clara's presence became almost constant, the child's spirit manifesting with increasing clarity as Eleanor's connection to the orphanage's tragedy deepened. The ghost could communicate more directly now, speaking in Eleanor's mind with words that carried the weight of desperate urgency. He's getting stronger. Every day you delay gives Father Callahan more power to manifest in the physical world. The Devourer feeds on the anniversary dates. Every October 13th, it grows a little more real, a little more capable of influencing events beyond the basement. We can feel him preparing for something. The 100th anniversary was significant, but he needs more than just time. He needs a willing servant to complete the work. Eleanor realized with growing horror that she might have been chosen for that role. Her presence at the orphanage, her academic expertise, her access to research resources, all of it could be part of Callahan's century-long plan. Perhaps he had drawn her there not as a potential savior for the children, but as a replacement for Sister Miriam, someone who could be corrupted or coerced into finishing what he had started. The possibility sent her into a panic that lasted 3 days, during which she seriously considered abandoning the investigation and fleeing Millbrook. But the children's voices followed her wherever she went, their pleas becoming more desperate as her resolve wavered. Clara appeared to her in the hotel bathroom mirror, her reflection showing wounds that hadn't been visible before, burn marks that suggested she had died in the fire rather than the basement ceremony. "Please don't leave us," Clara whispered, her ghostly tears falling like frost onto the mirror's surface. "You're the first person in 100 years who has seen the truth and survived. If you go, we'll be trapped forever. And Father Callahan will find another way to complete his work. How many more children will suffer because we couldn't find the courage to stop him?" Eleanor's breaking point came on her 7th night in Millbrook, when she woke to find her hotel room filled with the ghostly forms of all 47 children who had died at St. Agnes. They stood around her bed like a protective circle, their faces showing the full extent of their suffering, wounds from ritual knives, marks from restraints, eyes hollow with the knowledge of betrayal by those who should have protected them. But they weren't there to frighten her. They were there to show her something crucial. Each child bore a mark on their forehead, a symbol carved or burned into their flesh that matched the sigils Eleanor had seen in the basement chamber. The marks were still visible, even in death, binding them to the place of their murder and to the entity that had consumed their innocence. The marks, Clara's voice came clearer than ever before. They're the key to everything. Father Callahan carved them into us during the rituals, creating a permanent connection between our souls and the devourer. As long as the marks remain, we can't leave this place. But if someone could destroy the source of the marks, the altar where they were consecrated, then we might finally be free. Eleanor understood then what she had to do. It wasn't enough to simply expose the truth or document the children's suffering. To truly free them, she would have to return to the basement, confront Father Callahan's corrupted spirit, and find a way to destroy the altar that bound the children's souls to their place of torment. The task seemed impossible, but as Eleanor looked around at the ghostly faces surrounding her, faces that had once belonged to children who had faced impossible odds with courage beyond their years, she felt her resolve crystallizing into something unbreakable. Clara was right. She was the first person in a century to survive contact with the truth. That made her responsible for acting on that knowledge, regardless of the personal cost. She spent the remainder of the night planning her return to the basement, gathering supplies and preparing for what she knew would likely be her final confrontation with the evil that had consumed St. Agnes. As dawn approached and the children's spirits faded back into invisibility, Eleanor made a solemn promise to their memory. "I won't let you down. Whatever it takes, I'll find a way to set you free." But even as she spoke the words, she couldn't shake the feeling that Father Callahan was listening from the shadows, his hollow laughter echoing like a promise of his own. The town of Millbrook had built itself around forgetting. Eleanor discovered this truth as she expanded her investigation beyond the orphanage grounds, seeking corroboration for Clara's diary and additional context for the events of 1911. What she found was a conspiracy of silence so comprehensive and long-standing that it had become part of the community's very identity. Mrs. Catherine Henley, the librarian who had initially helped Eleanor, proved to be the first crack in that wall of silence. When pressed about her grandmother's connection to the parish office, the elderly woman broke down in tears that seemed to carry the weight of decades. "We all knew," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the library's afternoon quiet. "Not the details, but we knew something terrible had happened. My grandmother tried to tell people what she'd seen in Father Callahan's correspondence, letters from bishops ordering silence, payments made to families to relocate and forget, documents that disappeared from files overnight. But who was going to believe an Irish immigrant woman against the word of the Catholic Church?" Mrs. Henley led Eleanor to a private room behind the library's main collection, where she revealed a cache of documents that her family had hidden for 4 generations. The papers painted a picture of systematic cover-up that extended far beyond Millbrook's borders, reaching into the highest levels of the church hierarchy. Bishop Thomas Corrigan, who had overseen the diocese during the orphanage years, had received at least 3 separate reports questioning Father Callahan's methods and the unusual number of child deaths at St. Agnes. Each report had been filed and forgotten, their authors reassigned to distant parishes or quietly forced into early retirement. When Sister Miriam had attempted to report the truth about what was happening in the basement, Bishop Corrigan had not only ignored her letter, but had ordered her superior to place her in a penitential retreat where she could be monitored and silenced. "The church protected him," Mrs. Henley said, her anger evident despite her whispered tone. "They knew what he was doing, but the scandal would have been too great. Better to let children die than admit they had failed to properly supervise one of their own." Eleanor found similar patterns in her interviews with Millbrook's oldest residents. Those willing to speak at all shared fragmented memories that suggested widespread knowledge of the orphanage's true nature, coupled with an equally widespread conspiracy to remain silent about it. Parents had warned their children to stay away from St. Agnes grounds, not because of structural dangers or liability concerns, but because of stories passed down through whispered family conversations. Agnes Hartwell, the nursing home resident who had survived her time at the orphanage, provided the most devastating testimony. Her memories, fragmentary but emotionally vivid, revealed that the town's complicity extended beyond mere willful ignorance. People brought their problem children to Father Callahan, she said, her aged hands trembling as she spoke. Families who couldn't handle a rebellious son or a daughter who asked too many questions about why women couldn't be priests. They'd make donations to the orphanage and arrange for temporary stays that became permanent. The parents thought they were just getting rid of troublesome children. They didn't know they were feeding them to something hungry. The revelation that some of the orphanage children had been deliberately placed there by their own families added another layer of horror to an already nightmarish situation. Eleanor realized that the 47 children who died hadn't all been true orphans. Some had been sacrificed by parents who found their curiosity or independence inconvenient. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a retired psychiatrist who had grown up in Millbrook during the 1940s, provided insight into the long-term psychological effects of the town's collective secret. Millbrook has always had unusually high rates of depression, anxiety, and what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, she explained during a careful interview in her home. The official explanation focused on economic hardship and social isolation, but I began to suspect something deeper was at work. Communities that harbor dark secrets develop pathologies that persist across generations. Dr. Morrison had discovered this truth through her own family history. Her grandfather had been part of the volunteer fire brigade that responded to the St. Agnes fire, and his private journals, which she shared with Eleanor, contained details that had never appeared in official reports. The basement was still burning when we arrived. She read from her grandfather's journal, not natural fire, something that burned cold and smelled like sulfur and rotting meat. Some of the men refused to go down there, saying they could hear voices calling to them from the flames. My grandfather was a practical man, not given to supernatural explanations, but he wrote that the basement felt wrong in ways that made his soul shiver. The journal also contained sketches of symbols that had been carved into the basement walls, symbols that matched Eleanor's photographs from her descent into the chamber. Her grandfather had copied them, perhaps hoping that documentation might help him make sense of what he had witnessed. Instead, the symbols had haunted him for the rest of his life, appearing in his dreams and driving him to research that eventually led to a nervous breakdown. Eleanor's investigation revealed that similar breakdowns had affected other first responders and investigators over the decades. Police officers who had handled reports of disturbances at the orphanage ruins, social workers who had attempted to research the missing children for family reunification efforts, even historians who had tried to write about the fire, all had experienced psychological crises that ended their involvement with the case. "It's like the place protects itself," Dr. Morrison observed. "People who get too close to the truth find themselves overwhelmed by depression, anxiety, sometimes full psychotic breaks. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidental. Whatever happened in that basement created something that actively defends itself against exposure." The town's silence wasn't just about covering up institutional failure or protecting the church's reputation. It was about self-preservation in the face of something that could reach out from the past and destroy anyone who threatened to reveal its existence. Eleanor found evidence of this supernatural protection in newspaper archives from surrounding towns. Reporters who had tried to investigate the St. Agnes fire had found their research repeatedly frustrated by missing documents, sources who refused to speak, and technical difficulties that prevented publication of their stories. The few articles that had been published contained significant factual errors that suggested deliberate misinformation rather than simple reporting mistakes. The pattern extended to academic researchers as well. Eleanor discovered thesis papers and doctoral dissertations that had attempted to examine the orphanage fire as part of broader studies of institutional failures or fire safety regulations. In every case, the sections dealing with St. Agnes contained obvious gaps, unexplained omissions or conclusions that contradicted the researchers' own evidence. "It's like there's a field of interference around the whole subject," Eleanor wrote in her own research notes. Information exists, but it becomes unreliable when people try to compile it into a coherent narrative. Witnesses forget crucial details, documents disappear or become illegible, physical evidence degrades faster than it should. The truth wants to be told, but something is actively working to prevent that from happening. As Eleanor compiled her evidence, she began to experience the same interference effects that had frustrated previous researchers. Her digital files became corrupted, her handwritten notes developed smudges and stains that made them difficult to read, and her photographs of the basement chamber showed increasing distortion with each viewing. But Clara's spirit continued to guide her, appearing in moments of frustration to provide encouragement and additional information. The ghost child had grown stronger as Eleanor's investigation progressed, feeding off the historian's determination to expose the truth. The town's silence is part of Father Callahan's protection, Clara explained during one of their conversations. Every person who knows the truth but refuses to speak it makes him stronger. Every lie told to cover up what happened feeds the devourer. The only way to break the cycle is to force the truth into the light, no matter how much resistance you encounter. Eleanor realized that her investigation had to expand beyond simply documenting what had happened. She needed to find a way to compel the town to acknowledge its complicity, to force the community to confront the consequences of a century of willful blindness. Only by breaking the conspiracy of silence could she hope to weaken Father Callahan's hold on the children's spirits. But as she prepared for this final phase of her work, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the town's silence wasn't just about fear or complicity. There was something else. A sense that Millbrook itself had been changed by its proximity to the orphanage's evil, transformed into something that existed primarily to serve as camouflage for the horror that still lurked beneath St. Agnes. The children deserved better than to be forgotten by a community that had failed to protect them in life and refused to remember them in death. Eleanor made a promise to their memory. She would shatter the silence, whatever the cost to herself or to the town that had harbored evil for too long. Eleanor's second descent into the basement of St. Agnes came on the night of October 12, 2011, exactly 100 years after Clara had written her final diary entry. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, gathering supplies and steeling herself for what she knew would be her final confrontation with the evil that had consumed the orphanage. The entrance to the basement stood open this time, as if Father Callahan's corrupted spirit was inviting her deeper into his domain. The air that rose from below carried scents that belonged to the night of the fire, smoke and burning flesh, terror sweat, and the metallic tang of spilled blood. Eleanor's flashlight beam seemed weaker than before, swallowed by shadows that moved with independent purpose. The children's voices grew stronger as she descended, no longer whispers but clear, desperate pleas that echoed from the stone walls. "Don't let him finish it. Free us before midnight. The fire is coming. The fire is already here." Eleanor reached the bottom of the stairs to find the basement chamber transformed. Where before it had been a static monument to past atrocities, now it pulsed with malevolent energy that made the very air shimmer like heat waves. The altar at the chamber's center glowed with phosphorescent symbols that hurt to look at directly, and the bones scattered around its base had been arranged into new patterns that suggested recent manipulation. Father Callahan's presence was stronger here than ever before, his corrupted spirit manifesting as a shadow that wore the approximate shape of a man, but moved with the fluid grace of something that had never been fully human. When he spoke, his voice came from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating through the stones themselves. "Welcome, Eleanor Price. I have been waiting for you to return. Tonight, on the centennial of my first great work, you will help me complete what was interrupted by fire and fear." Eleanor's hand found the gasoline container she had brought, but her voice remained steady despite her terror. "I'm here to stop you, to free the children you've kept trapped in this place." Callahan's laughter was the sound of stones grinding against each other, empty of human warmth. "Free them, child. You understand so little." They are not prisoners, they are the foundation stones of a new reality. Their suffering has been refined by a century of anguish, distilled into something far more precious than mere innocence. They are perfect now, seasoned by despair, and ready to fuel the Devourer's manifestation in your world. The chamber began to fill with ghostly figures, not just the 47 children who had died at St. Agnes, but dozens of others who had vanished over the decades since the fire. Eleanor realized with horror that Callahan's work hadn't ended in 1911, it had merely become more subtle, more carefully hidden. Missing children from surrounding towns, runaways who had never been found, troubled youth who had simply disappeared, all had fed the Devourer's hunger as it waited for the proper time to fully enter the physical world. Every October 13th, I have claimed new offerings. Callahan's shadow form circled Eleanor like a predator stalking prey. The church thought they had contained me, but death only freed me from the limitations of flesh. I have had a century to perfect my methods, to identify children whose disappearances would cause minimal investigation. The Devourer has grown fat on their terror and despair. Clara's spirit appeared between Eleanor and the approaching shadow, her ghostly form blazing with determination that had been forged in the fires of unimaginable suffering. Don't listen to him. He's weaker than he pretends. That's why he needs you alive, why he can't simply take you as he took us. The binding ritual requires a willing participant, someone who chooses to serve the Devourer rather than being forced into submission. Eleanor understood then why she had been drawn to this place, why her research had been so successful when others had failed. Callahan had been guiding her, manipulating her investigation to bring her to this moment when she would have to choose between her own survival and the children's freedom. You could serve willingly. Callahan's voice took on a seductive tone that made Eleanor's skin crawl. Think of the knowledge I could share with you. Secrets that predate human civilization, power that would make you a goddess among mortals. All I require is your assistance in completing the final ceremony. Help me bind these children's souls permanently to the Devourer, and I will share its gifts with you. The offer was accompanied by visions that flooded Eleanor's mind unbidden, images of herself wielding supernatural power, commanding forces that could reshape reality according to her will. She saw herself as a scholar priestess, uncovering truths that would revolutionize human understanding of the universe's hidden dimensions. The temptation was real and immediate, playing on her deepest desires for knowledge and recognition. But the children's voices cut through the seductive visions, reminding her of why she had come. Remember us. Don't let him win. Choose mercy over knowledge. Eleanor looked around the chamber at the ghostly faces that watched her with desperate hope, and her choice became clear. She unscrewed the cap from her gasoline container and began dousing the altar and the symbols carved into the floor around it. Fire couldn't stop me before, Callahan snarled, his seductive tone replaced by rage that made the chamber walls tremble. What makes you think it will work now? Because this isn't the same fire, Eleanor replied, her voice growing stronger as she worked. The fire of 1911 was meant to hide your crimes. This fire is meant to expose them. This fire carries the prayers of innocent children and the determination of someone who refuses to let evil triumph. She struck a match and held it over the gasoline-soaked altar, but before she could drop it, Callahan's shadow form lunged toward her with inhuman speed. The impact knocked her backward, the match flying from her fingers to land harmlessly on wet stone. Eleanor found herself pinned beneath something that felt both incorporeal and crushingly heavy, Callahan's corrupted spirit pressing down on her with the weight of a century's accumulated malice. His face, when it solidified enough to be seen clearly, was a twisted parody of clerical dignity, features that might once have been handsome now warped by decades of communion with inhuman evil. You will serve, he hissed, his breath carrying the stench of sulfur and decay. Willingly or unwillingly, you will help me complete the great work. The Devourer hungers, and it will be fed. But even as Callahan's grip tightened around her throat, Eleanor felt small hands grasping her arms. her legs, her shoulders. The ghostly children were surrounding them both, their combined will focused on protecting the one person who had come to their aid. Clara's voice rose above the others, clear and commanding. We choose to remember ourselves. We choose to be more than victims. We choose to fight. The children's spirits blazed brighter, their combined light driving back the shadows that had cloaked the chamber for so long. Callahan's form began to waver and lose cohesion as the very foundation of his power, the despair and helplessness of his victims, transformed into righteous anger and determination. Eleanor felt the pressure on her throat ease, and she gasped for air as she struggled to her feet. Another match appeared in her hand. She couldn't remember taking it from the book, but Clara's spirit stood beside her, guiding her movements with ghostly hands that felt surprisingly warm and solid. Now, Clara whispered, while he's weakened, burn it all down and set us free. Eleanor dropped the match onto the gasoline-soaked altar. The flames that erupted were unlike any fire she had ever seen. They burned white-hot and absolutely clean, consuming the evil that had stained the chamber while leaving the children's spirits untouched. The symbols carved into the floor and walls began to crack and crumble as the fire spread, their power broken by flames that carried redemption rather than destruction. Callahan's scream of rage and despair echoed through dimensions, a sound that made reality itself shudder. His shadow form was caught in the spreading fire, the flames consuming the spiritual corruption that had sustained him for over a century. As he burned, Eleanor saw glimpses of what he had once been, a young priest filled with genuine faith, who had been seduced by promises of knowledge and power, ultimately becoming a willing servant of something that devoured everything he had once held sacred. The children's spirits began to fade as the fire spread, but their fading was peaceful rather than violent. One by one, they turned to Eleanor with expressions of gratitude and relief before dissolving into points of light that rose toward the ceiling and disappeared. Clara was the last to go, lingering until the flames had consumed every trace of the symbols that had bound her to the chamber. She looked at Eleanor with eyes that held wisdom far beyond her apparent years. Thank you for remembering us. Thank you for refusing to let us be forgotten. Now our story can be told, and no one else will suffer as we did. The ghost child smiled, the first truly happy expression Eleanor had seen in that place of sorrow, and then she too faded into light that rose toward freedom. Eleanor climbed the basement stairs as the fire spread behind her, consuming corruption but leaving the structure intact. She emerged into the pre-dawn darkness of October 13, 2011, carrying with her the knowledge that 47 children had finally found peace after a century of torment. But as she walked away from the smoldering ruins of St. Agnes, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that her work was not yet complete. The truth still needed to be told, the conspiracy of silence still needed to be shattered, and the world still needed to learn what had happened in that place of shadows and lies. The children were free, but their story remained to be written. Dawn broke over Millbrook on October 13, 2011, to find Eleanor Price standing before the assembled town council with documentation that would shatter a century of carefully maintained silence. She had not slept since her confrontation with Father Callahan's spirit, but adrenaline and righteous purpose kept her focused as she prepared to force the community to confront its complicity in unspeakable evil. The council chamber was packed beyond capacity, filled not only with local officials but with residents who had been drawn by rumors of Eleanor's investigation. The atmosphere was tense with the kind of anticipation that precedes either revelation or violence. Many faces in the crowd showed the guilty knowledge of people who had spent their lives avoiding uncomfortable truths. Eleanor had arranged her evidence with the meticulous care of a prosecutor, building a case against history itself. Clara's diary lay open to its most damning passages, surrounded by photographs from the basement chamber, copies of church documents that revealed the cover-up, and testimonies from survivors who had finally found the courage to speak. But most compelling of all were the recordings she had made during her final night at St. Agnes, audio that captured not only Father Callahan's confessions, but the voices of children who had been silenced for 100 years. "Ladies and gentlemen," Eleanor began, her voice carrying clearly through the crowded chamber, "I stand before you today as a witness to the greatest injustice this community has ever known. For 100 years, the town of Millbrook has built its identity around forgetting the murder of 47 innocent children. Today, that silence ends." The mayor, Robert Sterling, attempted to interrupt with procedural objections, but Eleanor's voice rose above his protests. These children were not victims of accident or neglect. They were systematically sacrificed by a man who wore the robes of God, but served something that was God's opposite. And this community, your parents, your grandparents, your religious and civic leaders, knew the truth and chose to bury it rather than seek justice. She began reading from Clara's diary, her voice breaking as she recounted the child's careful documentation of systematic abuse and ritual murder. The chamber fell silent as the full horror of what had happened at St. Agnes became undeniable. When Eleanor played the audio recordings from the basement, several people in the audience began to weep, their carefully constructed denials finally crumbling before the weight of truth. Mrs. Catherine Henley stood up from her seat in the front row, her aged voice trembling but determined. "She's telling the truth. My family has kept documents hidden for 4 generations, evidence that the church and the town government conspired to cover up what Father Callahan was doing. We were cowards then, and we've been cowards ever since." Her admission opened the floodgates. Other elderly residents began to speak, sharing family stories that had been whispered in private but never acknowledged publicly. Agnes Hartwell, brought from the nursing home in a wheelchair, provided the most devastating testimony of all. "I escaped because my aunt came to take me away 3 days before the fire. She said she'd had dreams about children burning, and she wouldn't let me stay another night in that place. I was 7 years old, and I knew my friends were going to die, but I was too scared to warn them. I've carried that guilt for 100 years, and now I want everyone to know that Clara Morrison and Thomas Fletcher and Mary Catherine O'Brien and all the others, they were real children with real names, and they mattered." Eleanor had prepared a list of all 47 children who had died at St. Agnes, compiled from fragmentary records and testimonies. As she read each name aloud, she could see the impact on the assembled crowd. These weren't statistics or abstract victims, they were individuals who had been erased from history by people who found their suffering inconvenient. The town's physician, Dr. Sarah Martinez, stood to address the assembly. "As a medical professional, I've always wondered about the unusual patterns of mental illness, depression, and anxiety in our community. Now I understand. We've been living with the psychological effects of collective trauma for generations. The silence hasn't protected us. It's poisoned us." Eleanor had anticipated resistance from the Catholic Church's representatives, but Father Michael Torres, the current parish priest, surprised her by offering full cooperation. "The Church has made many mistakes in its history, but few as grievous as what happened at St. Agnes. I pledge that our diocese will provide full access to any remaining records and will cooperate with any investigation. These children deserve justice, even if it comes a century late." The most dramatic moment came when Eleanor played the final recording from the basement, Father Callahan's own voice, captured during their supernatural confrontation, confessing to decades of ritual murder and explaining his bargain with the entity he called the Devourer. The audio was distorted and filled with sounds that shouldn't have been possible, but Callahan's words were unmistakably clear. "I have fed the Devourer for 30 years, offering it the pure souls of children whose innocence had not yet been corrupted by the compromises of adult life. Each sacrifice made me stronger, gave me deeper knowledge of the hidden truths that govern reality. The Church thought they were assigning me to minister to orphans, but I was harvesting them for a higher purpose." The recording continued with descriptions of specific rituals, naming children who had been sacrificed and describing methods of torture that had been designed to maximize spiritual suffering rather than mere physical pain. Several people in the audience had to leave the chamber, overcome by the horror of what they were hearing. But Eleanor's presentation wasn't focused solely on documenting past atrocities. She had also prepared a plan for moving forward, for transforming the community's relationship with its history. The children of St. Agnes can finally rest in peace, but our work is not finished. This community owes them a debt that can never be fully repaid, but we can begin by ensuring they are properly remembered. I propose that we establish a memorial at the orphanage site, with each child's name inscribed in stone, along with a full accounting of what happened to them. We need to create an educational program that teaches the truth about St. Agnes to every school child in this county, so that ignorance can never again be used as an excuse for inaction. Eleanor also called for a full investigation into the church's role in covering up the murders, demanding that all relevant documents be released and that officials who had participated in the conspiracy be named publicly, even posthumously. She wanted criminal charges filed wherever possible and civil remedies pursued on behalf of the victims' descendants. Most importantly, she concluded, we need to acknowledge that this community failed these children twice, first by allowing them to be murdered, and second by choosing to forget them afterward. We cannot undo those failures, but we can ensure they never happen again by committing ourselves to vigilance, transparency, and the protection of the vulnerable. The town council voted unanimously to accept Eleanor's recommendations, though she suspected their cooperation was motivated more by fear of legal liability than genuine remorse. But the community's response was more encouraging. Donations began pouring in for the memorial fund, even before the meeting ended, and several residents volunteered to help with research and documentation efforts. As Eleanor packed her equipment after the meeting, Clara's spirit appeared to her one final time. The ghost child looked different now, peaceful, complete, ready to move on to whatever came after death, for souls that had finally found justice. "Thank you," Clara whispered, her voice carrying the gratitude of all 47 children who had suffered at St. Agnes. "We can rest now, knowing that our story has been told and our sacrifice has meaning. But remember, evil like Father Callahan's doesn't die easily. Stay vigilant and teach others to recognize the signs of spiritual corruption before it can take root." Eleanor nodded, understanding that her work at St. Agnes was complete, but that her broader mission was just beginning. There were other forgotten tragedies, other silenced victims, other communities that had chosen comfort over truth. Clara and her fellow victims had taught Eleanor that the dead could not rest until the living found the courage to remember them with honesty and honor. As the ghost child faded into light for the final time, Eleanor felt a profound sense of completion. Justice had been served, truth had been told, and the innocent had been vindicated. The children of St. Agnes would never be forgotten again. 6 months after the town council meeting that shattered Millbrook's century of silence, Eleanor Price stood before the newly completed memorial at the site where St. Agnes Orphanage had once cast its shadow over the lives of innocent children. The memorial was simple but powerful, 47 granite stones arranged in a circle, each bearing the name of a child who had died, along with their age and the inscription, "Remembered always, forgotten never." At the center of the circle stood a larger monument, its bronze plaque bearing Clara's final diary entry in its entirety, ensuring that anyone who visited would understand not just that children had died here, but how they had lived, how they had suffered, and how they had ultimately found the courage to demand justice from beyond the grave. The dedication ceremony drew visitors from across New England, historians, clergy, child welfare advocates, and families who had discovered their own connections to the orphanage's tragedy. Eleanor's book about the St. Agnes murders had become a bestseller, not because readers enjoyed the horror, but because they recognized the importance of bearing witness to evil that had been hidden for too long. Father Michael Torres offered a prayer for the children's souls, his words carefully chosen to acknowledge both their suffering and their ultimate triumph over the forces that had sought to consume them. These children were failed by the adults who should have protected them, he said, his voice carrying to the crowd of nearly 1,000 people who had gathered for the dedication. But their courage in the face of unimaginable evil teaches us that innocence once lost can be reclaimed through truth and remembrance. Eleanor's speech was brief, but emotionally devastating. She spoke about Clara's diary, about the ghostly voices that had guided her investigation, and about the responsibility that fell on the living to remember the dead with honesty rather than convenience. She talked about the patterns that allowed predators like Father Callahan to operate: institutional protection, community denial, and the willingness of adults to sacrifice children's welfare for their own comfort. The children of St. Agnes were murdered twice, Eleanor said, her words echoing across the memorial grounds, first by Father Callahan and his demonic bargain, and second by a community that chose to forget them rather than seek justice. Today we ensure that the second murder is finally reversed. Today they are remembered as they deserved to be remembered, as individuals who mattered, who had dreams and fears and hopes, who trusted the adults in their lives to protect them. The ceremony concluded with the reading of all 47 names, each one followed by a moment of silence that felt heavy with the weight of acknowledgement too long delayed. As the crowd dispersed, many visitors lingered to place flowers at individual stones, to trace the carved names with their fingers, to whisper apologies to children who had died before their grandparents were born. Eleanor remained after everyone else had left, sitting beside Clara's stone as evening fell over the memorial grounds. She had felt the child's presence strongly during the ceremony, a warmth and contentment that spoke of a soul finally at peace. The ghostly visitations had ended after the town council meeting, but Eleanor sometimes felt Clara's influence in her work, a gentle guidance toward other forgotten tragedies, other silenced voices that deserved to be heard. The St. Agnes investigation had changed Eleanor's career trajectory completely. Instead of focusing on architectural preservation, she now specialized in historical injustices, cases where communities had chosen to forget rather than confront uncomfortable truths about their past. Her methodology, developed through her experiences with Clara's spirit, emphasized the voices of victims over the narratives of institutions, seeking truth in personal testimonies rather than official records. She had established the Children's Memory Project, a non-profit organization dedicated to researching and documenting cases of child abuse that had been systematically covered up by religious, educational, or governmental institutions. The project had already identified dozens of situations similar to St. Agnes, places where children had suffered while adults looked away, where institutional power had been used to silence victims rather than protect them. Eleanor's phone buzzed with a text message from her research assistant. Found something in the Wisconsin archives. Catholic Boys' School, 1950s, pattern of disappearances, basement rituals. Sounds familiar. Worth investigating. Eleanor smiled grimly as she typed her response. Send me everything you've got, and start looking for surviving witnesses. The work was exhausting and often heartbreaking, but it felt like a calling that had been forged in the flames of St. Agnes. Every forgotten child deserved a voice, every silenced victim deserved acknowledgement, every covered-up tragedy deserved exposure to the light of truth. As full darkness settled over the memorial, Eleanor felt a familiar presence, not Clara this time, but something broader and more encompassing. The collective spirit of every child who had ever been failed by the adults who should have protected them, drawing strength from the knowledge that their suffering had not been meaningless if it led to greater vigilance in protecting others. Eleanor stood and placed her hand on Clara's stone one final time. Thank you for trusting me with your story, she whispered to the darkness. Thank you for showing me that the dead can speak if the living have the courage to listen. The night wind carried her words across the memorial grounds, where 47 stones stood in eternal testimony to the truth that evil, no matter how carefully hidden, cannot remain buried forever. Justice might be delayed, but it cannot be denied when the innocent refuse to be forgotten. Eleanor walked away from the memorial knowing that her work was far from over. There were other St. Agnes orphanages scattered across the country, other Father Callahans hiding behind institutional authority, other communities choosing comfortable lies over difficult truths. But she also walked away knowing that the children of St. Agnes had not died in vain. Their suffering had awakened a determination to protect the vulnerable, to question authority, and to never again allow institutional power to silence the voices of victims. In death, Clara Morrison and her fellow orphans had accomplished what they could never have achieved in life. They had forced the world to listen, to remember, and to act. Their memorial would stand as a permanent reminder that the innocent once lost could be found again through the courage of those willing to seek justice in the darkness. The silence of St. Agnes was broken forever, replaced by voices that would echo through generations, ensuring that such horrors could never again be hidden beneath the comfortable lies of those who preferred forgetting to fighting. As Eleanor drove away from Millbrook for the final time, she carried with her the knowledge that some stories demand to be told, no matter how much time has passed or how many people prefer to keep them buried. The children of St. Agnes had waited 100 years for their truth to be acknowledged. Eleanor would spend the rest of her life ensuring that other forgotten children wouldn't have to wait as long. The dead had taught her that memory is a form of resurrection, that acknowledgement is a form of justice, and that the living have a sacred obligation to bear witness to suffering that others would prefer to ignore. In the end, that might be the most important lesson of all, that love, even for strangers separated by decades of death, has the power to transform both the living and the dead. Clara and her fellow orphans were finally free, their story finally told, their memory finally honored. And in that freedom, in that truth, in that remembrance, lay the seeds of a better world, one where children are protected rather than preyed upon, where truth is valued over comfort, and where the innocent are never again forgotten in service of institutional convenience. The silence was broken, the truth was told, the children were remembered. And that, Eleanor knew, was enough.